I told him, we would like to see this in Arabic as well, because it's the Arabic audience who also need to be educated. He spent, of course, a good part of his life for writing the PhD, although he had to put a lot of work after that in order to turn him into a book. He will. I left him the platform to say anything about the book or anything about the topic of the book. But as I told Shadi this morning, every Egyptian now is between being depressed, anxious, or in despair because they don't know how to answer what's next for Egypt. If he can reflect on that within the context of his book, it would be great. But I would leave really the platform to him, and I would like you to join me in welcoming Shadi Hamid.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation and for having me, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'll talk for about a half an hour or so. I don't want to talk too long, and I just want to start off first by laying some of the broader context, and then we can maybe get into specifics about the Muslim Brotherhood after the coup and where do they go from here, and more generally, is there any hope for Egypt, and how should we kind of look at the next 2 to 5 years and beyond. So let me actually just start with a little bit from before the Arab Spring in 2010. So I got to know ex-President Mohamed Morsi a little bit before he became president. We had a number of interviews, and the first time I met him was in May 2010, and that was about 7 or 8 months before the Arab Spring started. So it was a very interesting time, a very tense time. If some of you recall, the repression under Mubarak was getting worse, and then in the 2010 parliamentary elections, just 2 months before Mubarak fell, the Muslim Brotherhood only won 0 seats. Obviously, it was totally rigged, the elections, and it was really interesting then because the Brotherhood was thinking that they would have no place in politics, they would be erased from the political scene, they would have no seats in parliament, so they were very much thinking about the long term. But it's really interesting to look back and realize that they were thinking that just a couple months before Mubarak fell, and then look at how much things changed very quickly thereafter, which I think is an important lesson that the situation in these countries, and in Egypt in particular, has been very fluid. It can change radically in a short period of time. Now, in that May 2010 meeting I had with Morsi, it was very interesting. When I was writing the book, I went back to my old recordings, not just with Morsi, but with the many Brotherhood leaders that I had gotten to know over the years. And there was one quote from Morsi that really stood out to me, and I'll just quote it for you. So I described the Muslim Brotherhood as an opposition group, but he objected to the use of the word opposition. So this is what he told me, quote unquote, "The word opposition has the connotation of seeking power, but at this moment we are not seeking power because that requires preparation and society is not prepared." So very much you have this mindset that power is not part of the discussion. If power comes, it'll come far into the future, even to the extent that he wasn't comfortable with the very word opposition, which is quite interesting, I think. Similarly, Rashid al-Nushi, the head of Ennahda in Tunisia, and my book is focused on Egypt, but I also discuss the Jordanian Brotherhood and the Nahda in Tunisia, so it's more of a comparative approach. But al-Nushi said something very similar along these lines as well years ago when he was in exile in London. He said the most dangerous thing is for Islamists to be loved before they come to power and hated afterwards. Fast forward a little bit to 2 months after Mubarak fell. So this was in May 2011. I met with Hassam al-Arian, and again, I was looking back at the old recordings, and he said something very interesting that day in May 2011, he said, quote unquote, the people won't accept an Islamist president. And then he went on to explain to me why the people weren't ready for it, why it wasn't a good idea, why the Brotherhood wouldn't run a presidential candidate. And we had a longer conversation about it, and I cite that in the book. And again, it was very interesting to look back and see, again, how much the approach to power shifted. What was really interesting about getting to know someone like Morsi before he became president is because at that time, no one would have dreamed, he wouldn't have ever dreamed that he'd become the first democratically elected head of state in Egyptian history. And knowing him, and I'm sure some of you have perhaps met him before at some point as well, but he's not necessarily the kind of person who would seem very attuned to that kind of role for a variety of reasons. But anyway, so we see a really striking shift because power didn't seem realistic. So we would have these discussions as academics, as analysts in Washington, before the Brotherhood came to power, asking precisely this question: what would happen if Islamists came to power in a place like Egypt? And even before the Arab Spring, before it seemed really realistic, it was very much a theoretical discussion. But it was one that was very important, especially in light of what happened in Algeria, to ask the question of to what extent is Islamism and democracy reconcilable, so on and so forth. When we have the democratic transition in Egypt, for the first time, these theoretical questions become very realistic, because for the first time, the Brotherhood, we could see the Brotherhood playing that role and moving into that position. They were the ones who were most likely to do well in parliamentary and presidential elections. They did in fact do quite well, with 41% in the parliamentary elections. So it became a very real discussion. And democracy brought out a lot of these deep sentiments in Egyptian society and brought it to the fore, because when everyone was being repressed, again, it wasn't a very realistic discussion, because no one could imagine that anyone other than Mubarak would be in power. So that they all had the same focus, and towards the end of the Mubarak era, we see a lot of cooperation between Islamists, liberals, and leftists. They have fundamental ideological disagreements, but they can all agree on one thing: getting rid of the dictator, right? So in a sense, that repressive atmosphere had a unifying effect on the opposition, and they could postpone the ideological issues and say, that's not our priority now, we'll get to that later. But once you remove the dictator, then you no longer have that common bond bringing you together. Your competition is no longer Mubarak, it's each other. And we see those divisions coming to the fore very quickly. Now, like one of the arguments I make in my book, and I've just been making more generally in the last few months and trying to understand how Egypt got to where it is today, is that there is a real fundamental ideological divide. Power, politics, economics are all part of the story, but beyond all of that, there is something deeper, that you have Islamists and you have non-Islamists, and we can call them whatever you'd like: liberals, leftists, non-Islamists, anti-Islamists, secularists, that whatever we want to call that group. They have very distinctive visions for their societies, and that has to be appreciated and understood. It's not simply about power. It's not simply about policies. And I'll get to that a little bit more in a bit. But I've been thinking about it more in that way over the past year, because I think one of the things we got wrong when Mubarak fell, when Ben Ali fell, our initial instinct as outsiders was to make comparisons with Latin America or Eastern Europe, because those were the most recent democratic transitions, and they were rather successful. So that made people optimistic, perhaps even overly optimistic. The main difference, though, in Latin America is that the primary division in those societies was largely economic in nature. So you had socialists, and then you had kind of right-wing military elites on the other side, but it was fundamentally about it was fundamentally about